Since 1843, The Economist has been the single most devoted and influential champion of liberalism anywhere in the world. But what exactly is liberalism, and what does the output of The Economist, in print for more than 175 years and still globally successful, tell us about its contradictions as an ideology and how it has responded to and been shaped by events, from the American Civil War to the end of European empire and, more recently, the global financial crisis? With me to discuss that today and more is Alexander Zevin, author of Liberalism at Large, The World According to The Economist, out with Verso Books. Alexander is an assistant professor at the College of Staten Island, University of New York, and an editor at the New Left Review. Alexander, welcome to Novara Media.
Thanks for having me.
We were talking just briefly before the show started about how youthful you are, given you've written this 400-page tome. It's a really thick book, well citated. The footnotes, I think, take out, 70, 80 pages plus. You're an assistant professor. When did you start writing this book? Because it's a real labor of love.
I started in 2010, shortly after the financial crisis, when I started graduate school, and it ballooned into this massive project because, when it began as a small article for Le Monde Diplomatique, it was really about thinking about The Economist's role in that 2008 financial crisis. What was their response on a policy level? Did it force them to revise their worldview about the wisdom of markets and the rationality of markets? And then I realized that The Economist actually not only had a fascinating history in its own right, and was itself a kind of not only a storied publication, but one that has this incredibly unique point of view and voice, but also has played a pivotal role via its editors, its writers, and its readers in the course of world events for over 2 centuries. So it just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and eventually I had to stop writing it, or I was going to lose my mind. But yeah, the footnotes. I mean, they originally were footnotes, then they became endnotes, and I'm glad you mentioned them because I was tortured about whether to put them at the bottom of the page or at the back. And there's lots in them as well.
It's one of those books you can imagine it being a sort of, that's the abridged version of what could have been a 5-volume sort of work, and that really comes across in the intensity and extent of the scholarship. The Economist was started in 1843, I believe. Can you just sort of briefly explain the conditions within which it began, why it was started as a publication, what were the motivations, what were the aspirations for those behind it?
Yeah, The Economist starts at an extraordinary moment in British history, really at the hinge when the struggle for free trade in the form of the Anti-Corn Law League, which in many ways models itself on the movement for abolition in Britain. It's a middle-class movement that involves millions of people. It involves petitions to Parliament, fairs. I mean, there's a whole kind of a wave of activity around the Anti-Corn Law League, as it was known, and it really expressed the growing political power of the middle classes, of the rising in industrial classes, to do away with the corn laws that were imposed in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars as a way of keeping grain prices up after the long years of Britain's counter-revolutionary battle with revolutionary France. And in the late 1830s and early 1840s, that fight is reaching its climax. And a guy named James Wilson, who deserves to be much better known, he's the founder of The Economist. He's a hat manufacturer. He inherits a large fortune from his father in Scotland, moves to London, and starts writing about political economy. He has the idea to start a magazine, which he wants to own outright. He sees it as a way to make money, and indeed he was right. He did make a lot of money publishing The Economist, and The Economist has, after the first few years, always been profitable, which is pretty remarkable for a print publication or for any media outlet. But it arises in that moment, that intense struggle to do away with the corn laws, and it also should be said that this is a moment in which Chartism is the first, as Engels put it, the first proletarian party is also forming. So So it's not just the rise of free trade ideology and of liberalism, which The Economist is really pivotal to. I can't stress that enough. It's not just a magazine about this newspaper, which some of your listeners may not think they care about, but they should. It's also about this worldview, and the stakes are extremely high. It's a moment when Chartism is also sort of dealt a series of blows, such that this ideology of free trade, which continues to be so deeply embedded in British culture, politics, and political economy, sees its triumph. So the paper starts in 1843. In 1846, the Corn Laws are abolished by Peel, who is a conservative, under pressure not only from the likes of James Wilson and Richard Cobden and John Bright and these other kind of fabled names in the struggle for free trade, all three of them involved in textile manufacturing, but also because of the Irish Famine. And so the Economist is at the center of all of that, of that struggle that kind of makes modern Britain.
Did it view itself as a movement publication? You said it comes out of the Anti-Corn Law League, this incipient movement for free trade. Did it see itself as essentially, from the outset, a political publication, making interventions in the political affairs of the country? It wasn't purely speculative and trying to engage in the realm of ideas.
No, it was both. That's what's so fascinating about reading the early Economist. When I started to study the historiography around liberalism, I would often encounter this idea that's fairly widespread that laissez-faire, the idea that the government should remove itself completely from the activities and self-organization of the market, right, was kind of an urban legend that no one had ever really advocated that. But The Economist is the purest expression of laissez-faire as a complete worldview that extends from foreign policy all the way to the organization of the state, of the home, and of moral life in Britain and abroad. So The Economist, when you read the issue issues, you see both an elaboration of doctrine. So Malthus and Smith and Ricardo are constantly mentioned, but at the same time, they are applied in particular cases. And in the early Economist, that means in response to every single movement for reform of the industrial system, the sort of system that Engels talks about in The Condition of the English Working Classes, the horrific tenements of Manchester, the smokestacks, the cholera, the disease, and the lack of open sewers, all of that, right? The Economist is elaborating a worldview that is at once philosophical and morally, robust, but is also about what do we do about the Railway Act? What do we do about the Health Act? What do we do about the 10-hour bill? What should our response be to, the factory bill? What about the poor laws? How should they be reformed? And who are the deserving poor and who are not? What should we do about Ireland? What should our response to the famine be? And so, what you see immediately is the way that laissez-faire as an ideology confronts demands for the government to do something about the condition of the English working class, or about the condition of the Irish peasantry, or about diplomatic affairs in Europe or the empire. So that I think is what is so interesting about reading the early Economist, and the fact that it is, how should I put it? It is completely unabashed. There is no beating around the bush. It circulates to just a few thousand readers, and it is completely confident that those readers understand what it is talking about, and the imperative to act according to this sort of world view of laissez-faire.
More than 175 years later, it hasn't really changed in that respect. I mean, I've spoken about this with a good friend, Ronan Burtonshaw at Tribune magazine, and when he's come from Jacobin in the United States, and he says, Jacobin, when we think about the publication we were creating, we look at The Economist, and this is effectively whether you're a low-grade civil servant in Brazil, whether you're a CEO in the city of London, you can take this, and it's basically telling you what to think. And it's a very unique publication, having that global reach and having that extraordinary history. touching on some of the actual positions that it did adopt in those earlier years, you mentioned the Irish famine. What was the Economist's position on that, for instance, in the 1840s? Immense amount of suffering, of course, happening just over the Irish Sea from England and Wales.
Well, yeah, I mean, that is one of the key episodes in the early part of the book. And James Wilson is not only writing pieces in The Economist about the response that the British government should have to the Irish famine, which is essentially to do nothing, which is actually quite difficult under the circumstances because of the extent of the suffering and the fact that it was known in advance that the famine would be taking place. In other words, the blight that came to the potato in Ireland was that there were warning signs that the crop would not be a good one. And there were all sorts of proposals on the table, not least from within the Tory party, but also among some liberals or some Whigs that the British government had to take out a loan, or the British government had to provide outdoor relief, not just had to provide outdoor relief, not just indoor relief. That Irish peasants and tenure law should change so that they had more control over their land, so they couldn't be kicked off it in the event that they couldn't pay their rent, which of course they couldn't in the circumstances. There were also proposals to restrict the export of grain, of butter, of milk, of other products that continued to be exported from Ireland during the famine. So there were all sorts of proposals on the table as to what to do about this. And The Economist is adamant that, in part because of Malthusian laws about population and food supply, that to aid the Irish peasantry to withstand or to overcome the famine would simply be an act of cruelty, because of course the iron law population shows that there simply is no way to support more people than the food supply can supply. So I mean, I'm being crude about that. There's also the wage fund theory that is invoked to describe the fact that eleemosynary aid would be misguided. But what I meant to say when I started to answer your question is that Wilson is not just writing articles in The Economist about this, along with his subordinates at the paper. There's just a few people that work there in the 1840s. That's one of the reasons it's so profitable, is it's just, three or four people and a few other writers who supply articles freelance, as it were. But he's also advising the government. He is exchanging letters with Lord Grey, who is in charge of Ireland, the Secretary of Ireland, and Lord Grey is asking him, what will the middle classes of England accept as an Irish policy? And actually, to be fair to him, he's a bit shocked at the degree to which Wilson advises really, really strict adherence to laissez-faire, even in the midst of this crisis. And then, of course, there's a series of coercion acts that get promulgated because there's concern that the Irish peasants will rebel if they are, if the government doesn't do something to end the famine or to mitigate the famine.
So The Economist, the publication, had a pretty egregious role, it's fair to say, in relation to the famine, both in terms of its editorial output, but also its engagement with politicians. The American Civil War. I mean, I just want to go through a few of these because I think it's useful to just to chart its positions at the high point, essentially, of English laissez-faire liberalism. The American Civil War, 1860s. How did the newspaper, it calls itself, how did it understand that? How did it comprehend that? And whose side was The Economist on when it came to the fight between the Union and the Confederacy?
Well, let's say it was consistently sympathetic to the cause of the Confederates without ever entirely coming out and saying that Britain should intervene on the side of the South. But there are reasons for that. One is that the cottonopolis in Manchester and elsewhere relied so heavily on slave-produced cotton in the American South. There's also the fact that the South, because it was dependent on Britain as an export market, also was a better free trader than the North. And after the Civil War, the North, of course, will impose very high tariffs in order to industrialize. And for many industrialists in Britain, this is not a prospect to be savored. Although in the event, the City of London does very well out of investing in North American railways and industries. So the Economist is consistently under Walter Bagehot, who I spend a fair amount of time talking about in the book. He is this authority on the English Constitution, and I hope we get to talk about the state of your constitution and the political system, because I think the book has a lot of bearing on that. Also for what's happening to the Labour Party and the Labour Party in general. But at any rate, they are over time more and more sympathetic to the cause of the South. And Walter Bagehot even makes the argument that a victory for the South will not only hasten the end of slavery, but will result in two states in North America that will balance the others, because he sees the North as a kind of a potential imperial rival to the British state. It's a fascinating section of the book that section was to research, because Bagehot, is so kind of how shall we say, kind of critical of the North and praising of the South. And the reasons for that kind of, I think, or the way that plays out in the book, again, does something that I wanted to do in the book, which was to invert our understanding of liberalism as an ideology, which is in practice not really so pacific or anti-imperial or opposed to slavery, for example, as it would seem. And that was something that I saw that was missing even in an excellent book by Sven Beckert, Empire of Cotton, that the role of The Economist as the preeminent liberal journal of opinion in Britain, connected to both the industrial interests in the North at that time and also the City of London, took a position on the U.S. Civil War that was highly favorable to the Southern slave-owning plantation system.
Yeah, it was something I think Gladstone did similar. There was a debate going on really within sort of liberal milieus. What I find really funny is reading the book is Bagehot says that the Confederacy is comprised of 5 to 6 million, men of Anglo-Saxon stock, and he insists this is why they won't be defeated by the North. So there's obviously quite clear racial undertones there. Was that ever made overt?
I think that within the concepts and ideas that the writers of The Economist and liberals in general in Britain are drawing on, there's a great deal of kith and kin, the idea of the Anglo-Saxon race. That doesn't mean it was the kind of uppermost sort of element in the expression of their worldview. For example, in the Governor Eyre controversy that takes place in 1865, this is an incident involving the governor of Jamaica who basically engages in a lynching of black Jamaicans, some of whom are members of the council, and this deeply divides opinion in Britain. And so people like John Stuart Mill are on one side, and on the other you have figures like Carlyle and so on. So Carlyle, of course, favors a deeply racialized view of black people as inferior, almost bestial. For people like John Stuart Mill and Bagehot, they share a sense that black people, the subjects of the empire, are inferior, but they also are sort of arguing for rule of law and for the idea that there is not necessarily an inherent racial difference, but that under British tutelage, the inferior races, as they would call them, can achieve something like liberal self-government. Of course, that date is always somehow deferred and in the distant horizon. My point is just that race is very much central to liberal understandings of empire, but it is often sort of a secondary element in comparison to highly racialized views of other figures such as Carlyle and others who are sort of adamant Tories, let's say.
And the background to all of this, the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, 1860s, is of course demands for suffrage. You get the Great Reform Act in Britain, 1832. I think the Second Reform Act is the 1864. You're probably a better 19th century scholar than I am. What did the magazine make of the demand for suffrage, of the idea of, at least in the 19th century, universal male suffrage? How did it respond to those demands?
Well, one of the things that I show, or that I want to point out to people, is that liberalism and democracy are not joined at the hip. And in fact, 19th century liberals are distinguished, not just at The Economist, but The Economist plays a pivotal role in articulating this, are distinguished by their hostility to the enfranchisement of the working classes. And in fact, for liberal political economy to function, for it to be implanted, it's essential that the working classes cannot vote. So the First, the Second, and the Third Reform Acts that span the 19th century and are supposedly, or in a kind of Whiggish conception of British history, are evidence of the kind of deep reformist wisdom and gradualism of British political life. Result in, by 1914, by the eve of the First World War, Britain has one of the most deeply undemocratic franchises in all of Europe. And yet, if you read a history textbook in the US or in Britain, you have a sense that on the eve of 1914, Britain is just a democracy along with the United States that has universal manhood suffrage. It's not true. And one of the reasons for that is because liberalism and democracy are sort of not necessarily inherently hostile to one another, but in the context of the 19th century are deeply in deep tension. And The Economist, under Bagehot in particular, articulates an absolute hostility to any notion that the franchise should be based on universal right. It's not a theory of the franchise that says that every adult male citizen, let alone every adult citizen, has the right to vote by virtue of being a person or being a citizen or a subject. It's a theory of the franchise that is based, even when it's extended up to 1914, on property, the ability to pay taxes, and or intelligence and education. And we see this not just in Bagehot, although Bagehot is fun to read because in the English Constitution, he's absolutely snobbish towards the working classes. I mean, Bagehot runs for office several times to become an MP. James Wilson is an MP. Many other Economist editors use The Economist as a stepping stone into office, first into Parliament and then into some of the highest offices of the state. Bagehot tries 4 times, I think, and fails each time. On one occasion, he's actually brought up on charges of corruption, that he's paid electors to come out to vote for him, which was common practice, but which a good liberal was not supposed to be involved in. And he goes to the panel of inquiry and imitates the voters, the kind of in a kind of Cockney accent. I mean, it's not Cockney, but some version of that. And so the contempt for the lower orders is absolutely mind-boggling in this kind of revered constitutional document that everyone from Harold Macmillan to Thatcher and Blair cite as a kind of reference point for how the British Constitution actually works. So that is a long-winded and digressive story about how hostile the Economist was, but I just want to emphasize that liberalism and democracy not conjoined at the hip, and actually the theory of the vote, the theory of the franchise that has operated in Britain up through the First World War is based on property, education, and taxation, and not on a universal ability or right to vote.
Now that we're talking about actually existing liberalism and some of the narratives it peddles in the 20th and 21st centuries, often I'm sure it's the same in the United States. If you're doing undergraduate degree or degree in political theory, the received wisdom, and this obviously percolates through into the broader common sense of the punditocracy, political and media classes, is that the genesis of liberalism is some point in the mid-17th century in England. We can say John Locke, we can be a little bit sort of contrarian and say actually it's Thomas Hobbes, the emergence of the idea of a social contract, rational individualist sort of rationality, etc. And we then get this thread going from Hobbes, Locke, Thomas Paine, through the American Revolution, coming back into England. And so we have this 350-year trajectory, effectively, of the liberal ideology and its culmination in the 20th century and its integration with market economics, but also mass democracy. What you're quite keen to emphasize in the book is that this is not remotely accurate. I mean, you've touched upon that in relation to Bacon. I mean, was that ever articulated by people like James Wilson? I mean, one of the funnier asides in the book is that you say that Wilson effectively stops reading literature in like his late teens, early 20s, because he realizes he knows everything he now needs to know to pontificate to the rest of the world about how things should be ordered. But did they look at Locke and Hobbes as kind of progenitors of this intellectual tradition, or is that something that's retrospectively applied to give it this veneer of legitimacy and sort of historical weight?
Yeah, I mean, my sense is that Locke becomes a canonical thinker of liberalism, you know, in the early Cold War, as a way of distinguishing not just liberalism, but the West and Western democracies from the Soviet Union and its satellite states and allies in the Third World, as a way of sort of saying it's not just democracy that distinguishes the West, it's liberal democracy, right? It's the safeguarding of these precious civil liberties and freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and the rule of law. So for James Wilson, Locke is not a crucial reference point, nor does he really figure centrally for many of the other thinkers up until we get to maybe the turn of the 20th century and the kind of rise of Bolshevism. And then there is this kind of turn to using figures from the 17th and 18th centuries even as guiding posts for liberalism in its battle to the death with Soviet communism. The exception to that is Adam Smith, who from the start is central to the Economist's understanding of liberalism. But even there, the what they make of Adam Smith and the way they deploy him is different, because Smith is often credited with a vision of markets as providential, and indeed he did see the kind of the reconciliation of the particular interest and the public good after Mandeville through a kind of divine act of you know, a kind of blind act of faith, to be honest. So the Economist certainly takes that over, but it you know, the moments where Smith says, well, public works are all right during a crisis, and you know, the kind of the fact that for Adam Smith, the very idea of foreign investment and of the mobility of capital is sort of does not figure centrally in his account of comparative advantage. And of course, that's Ricardo's concept, but the idea that trade between states and the wealth of nations might in some fundamental way be altered by the ability of capital to move around in as extensive a way as it comes to by the middle of the 19th century is just not present. So one of my arguments is that, you know, while by the 1830s, 40s, classical liberalism, which is not a British invention, by the way, it begins on the continent, and I try to demonstrate the way that it moves as a political concept into Britain and then becomes this kind of unique fusion of political and economic ideas that we associate with classical liberalism. What ends up happening at The Economist is that it answers a series of questions that the classical doctrine leaves unanswered. And so you've just pointed to one of those, which is what does it have to say about democracy, which early liberals are really not in favor of. And so, you know, the demands on the part of the working class for the vote is just an absolutely crucial question. And you know, The Economist provides a kind of running commentary and guide to what liberals are saying about this issue. You know, how much should they resist the idea that there should be universal manhood suffrage? How dangerous is that as a threat to the reign of private property and of low taxation and of a minimal state, and so on and so forth?
You touched upon briefly the idea of empire. You mentioned it earlier on in the show. We get the Indian Mutiny in 1856. I mean, I think it was the Morant Bay Rebellion, wasn't it, in Jamaica?
Yeah,
I could be wrong. We talked about that with Priya Gopal on a previous show. The Morant Bay Rebellion and particularly the Indian Mutiny were two big, decisive moments in 19th century British politics, political life. you know, in real time, like you say, with these internal debates within sort of very previously close friendship circles. How did the Economist respond to the Indian Mutiny? Well, of course, we get the transition from the East Indies Company overseeing much of South Asia, of course, you know, much more modern day India, and that then being overseen by the British sort of state administration. Did they see this as a good thing? Did they view the mutiny as something which was in some ways justifiable, or was it a totally sort of irrational outgrowth of, you know, native hostility and unthinking, you know, anger?
Yeah, I mean, I think the response to the Indian Mutiny is indicative of the way that the sort of liberal playbook, let's say, works at The Economist, which is repression and reform, right? So there is an acknowledgement that the Indian Mutiny arises out of deep-seated grievances with the way the British East India Company has been running India, from the kind of predation that the British East India Company has operated on, the fact that, you know, treaties are constantly being broken and other border states are being invaded and annexed by this kind of behemoth. The idea that Hindu religious practices are not being respected. You know, this also the Economist is able to acknowledge. And you know, even Queen Victoria, who I think a recent historian has tried to rehabilitate. Sorry, a historian recently has tried to rehabilitate as some kind of anti-imperialist. Even Queen Victoria acknowledges that the British will henceforward respect Indian customs to a greater degree than they have. So there's all sorts of ways in which the Economist acknowledges the need for reform in India. But what is unquestionable is the idea that the British should rule India. The idea that the Indian Mutiny is a proto-nationalist rebellion for Indian unification or for a free or independent Indian state is rejected outright. And the idea that anything but the most exemplary forms of repression, including taking Indian sepoys and mounting them to the mouths of cannons and blowing them away, you know, that is also par for the course, right? So I would say that that is the kind of consistent a way in which the Economist operates. In the Morant Bay Rebellion, great deal of criticism of Governor Eyre for taking the laws into his own hands. This is not the way the empire should be run, right? Liberals distinguish themselves in opposition to certain Tory publicists by disparaging aggressive imperialism, right? But the idea that therefore liberals were against empire or imperialism is wrong. And so the Indian Mutiny is an interesting example of the ways in which the kind of supple, let's say the more subtle or supple ways in which liberals acknowledge the need for reform within the empire and then act to sort of strengthen the hold of the British state on the empire. And just to get to the second part of your question, the paper favors the direct control of the British of India by Britain, the creation of the British Raj, in part because James Wilson goes out to India as the first Chancellor of the Indian Exchequer. So you have this extraordinary thing where the first editor and founder of The Economist becomes one of, if not the most powerful person in India, who is tasked in the aftermath of the Indian Rebellion with devising a financial system and a political system to a certain extent that will rule and run India so that the British can continue to operate there. And you know, he devises just as an example, and there's lots to discuss about the ways that this does or doesn't contradict liberal theories of how the state should work or whether or not Britain should even have an empire. He devises a guarantee for the state railway system to kind of encourage direct inward investment. And that's part of my story too, which is to constantly relate these political ideas to what's happening in the economy in a way that I don't think many historians have. So anyway, the Economist is in favor of the imposition of the British Raj.
And where does that come from? How much autonomy does the editor of the day have, for instance, in determining what the position of the magazine should be? Because they were in a minority, but there were liberal voices who were, you know, had great misgivings about the British Empire after the Indian Mutiny of 1856. is it possible that the Economist could have gone a different way? Because clearly there's a fragment of the British ruling class, which this magazine speaks to and speaks for, which decided that course of action was the best one to proceed with. But there is also something of an anti-imperial, I don't like to use that word retrospectively because they wouldn't have called themselves that, but there were liberals at the time who didn't agree with that way of going about things. So how was that determined? Do you think it was inevitable that the Economist was always going to have that line in India after 1856, or was there an element of contingency?
Well, I think, yes, it wasn't inevitable, because what I try to show is, look, my argument about the Economist is not that it is the only expression of liberalism, or that it is the purest expression of liberalism. It's that it is the dominant expression of liberalism. And by looking at it, we can organize the entire field of liberal thought. And that includes people who disagree with the Economist but continue to define themselves as liberal. So it's a way of defining liberalism that doesn't require a sort of very strict a definition that excludes these other strands or elements of liberalism. I think that's really important, and that's a failing of many accounts of the liberal tradition. What I show in the book is that in the 1850s, and again, this story is not really well known, by the time you get to the 1850s, the original cohesion of this group of free traders, of these people in the Anti-Corn Law League, like Cobden and Bright, but also James Wilson, right? There's a parting of the ways, because initially the theory is that a world of free trade is also a world of peace and goodwill among men. Right? The anti-aristocratic element in the free traders' thought is that it is, the aristocratic elements of the Constitution and of the British state that push foreign wars and imperial expansion, right? And that's an idea they take from Adam Smith, among many others. Protectionism, mercantilism, all of these evils arise from this quest and lust for empire. But by the 1850s, Cobden and Bright are continuing to take that line, and they take it all the way up through the Indian Mutiny. They take it as regards the Second Opium War that Britain is fighting at the exact same moment. And indeed, there's some amazing documents from Lord Elgin. John Nusinger wrote a great piece in the New Left Review about sort of the way that Lord Elgin, who was tasked with repressing both the Indian Mutiny and the Chinese in the Second Opium War, his racked conscience. But at any rate, the point is that by the time we get to the 1850s, Wilson and Cobden and Bright have a furious row about whether or not Britain should be doing any of these things, and whether or not it is a complete violation of everything that they had fought for as members of the Anti-Corn Law League. And indeed, Cobden and Bright feel betrayed by Wilson because they gave him funding, basically a list of contacts to start The Economist. And they denounce him furiously in private letters. I wouldn't let a dog read The Economist. Wilson is a complete puppet, they say, of the government of the day. And they lose their seats, and Wilson retains his seat. So this is also about the political popularity, the way that passions are whipped up by Palmerston. About the Indian Mutiny and the Second Opium War. So to answer, I'm sorry, I tend to be kind of long-winded in my replies, but there is an element of contingency in the sense that there are liberals who remain committed to the idea that peace equals free trade, or free trade equals peace, and then there is the version of it that Wilson ends up espousing, which is that war is absolutely necessary to structure the global economy according to the dictates of capital, and we cannot leave it to chance. And actually, they start to call the idea that free trade equals peace a shallow doctrine. And to criticize Bright and Cobden as puppets of the Tsar, and all sorts of other insults that wouldn't be out of place at all in the British media landscape today.
I was about to say, yeah, plus ça change.
Really, the consistency is alarming as regards the kind of linking of critics of the domestic and foreign policies of the British government to Russia in particular, but to any foreign power. And that is on the part of liberals. So sorry, that's just, yeah. So I'm kind of agreeing with you, but I'm just doing it in a very...
It's good to know that Russiagate had antecedents as far back as the 1850s. I mean, I could have confidently said, 1917, but I didn't know it went back that far. But I'm really happy you touched upon that, because that fracture is still there, particularly amongst British liberalism. If you look at, for instance, a pro-war position of somebody like a Tony Blair and the anti-war position of somebody like a Charlie Kennedy, they're ostensibly situated within that same political tradition. And you can very much see Charlie Kennedy as an inheritor of, he was more of a social democrat, perhaps on the economics front, but in terms of foreign policy, a Cobden or a John Bright, who, like you say, by the 1850s, 1860s, increasingly sounded like what was left of the remnants of the Chartist movement, particularly in the 1850s. So they'd really deviated from that current thing. Is a really important point to make. Now, liberalism develops really significantly through the, not talked about nearly enough, this huge economic depression of the 1870s, through scramble for Africa, the sort of apogee of European empire. And then by the turn of the 20th century, it's beginning to become something new. I mean, it's called, the new liberalism. Some people refer to it as yellow book liberalism. You get the People's Budget in this country, I think 1909. And all of a sudden, liberal parties, liberal politicians, liberal political theorists aren't as zealous when it comes to laissez-faire economics. Can you briefly explain, given your immense you've been reading about this stuff for a decade, why does that change amongst those liberal milieus? How does that happen? And then secondly, how does The Economist respond to it?
Yeah, okay, that's a complicated but very important question. The rise of new liberalism. There are a number of ways that scholars have dealt with that issue. Some have emphasized the rise of a much stronger and better organized working class trade union movement. So by the turn of the 20th century, you really have the development of trade unions that are much larger, no longer based simply on crafts unionism, but really on trade unionism as a kind of really new organizing concept. They're much larger and more powerful. And they also begin to seek political representation. So they begin to form what will become today's Labour Party. And the liberals are intensely vigilant about this and try to head it off. So one way of talking about this is to say that they respond to sort of pressure from below by devising schemes for social reform. But there are other intellectual, ideological ways of talking about it to do with the influence of thinkers like T.H. Green, Ruskin, even versions of Christian socialism, guild socialism, and also the influence of German idealism. So that's the kind of intellectual response that begins to emphasize community responsibility and the capacity of the state to not just a vision of the state that isn't just about sort of a negative liberty, but some conception of positive liberty in the sense that individuals are still at the center of this rather impoverished view of the state and of society, but it is one that says that the state should now be responsible for removing obstacles in the way of individual fulfillment. And this, if you like, is a kind of piecemeal progression upon the vision of laissez-faire that had existed in the 1840s and 50s. So that is a kind of intellectual sort of argument, and it draws on both domestic and foreign influences. I mentioned German idealism, but also some of these new liberal thinkers are also thinking about Spencer and Darwin, but applying their kind of notions of evolution to society. Others are making reference to John Stuart Mill, who, after all, after he published his Principles of Political Economy in 1848, quickly, in response to the 1848 revolutions, sort of adopts what he considers to be a version of socialism and a notion of common ownership as being the maybe endpoint of liberalism. So that's the intellectual side of the argument. And then there's also the imperial side of the argument, that liberals begin to become very concerned about imperial rivalry. The British Empire no longer rules the earth in kind of solitary magnificence, but is now being met by French, German, Russian, even American claims, and Japanese, I should say, claims to be world powers with their own interests in overseas colonies and in capturing overseas markets that the British had dominated for so long. So the interest in raising up an imperial race, especially for a fraction of the Liberal Party known as liberal imperialists, which includes figures like Haldane and Asquith and Grey, Lord Grey, the famous foreign minister who never visited another country and knew no other languages, who presided over the disaster of Britain's involvement in the First World War. He was the guy who said that the lights are going out in Europe and will not be lit again in our lifetime, even though he was largely responsible for extinguishing those lights because of his secret negotiations with France to come to its aid in the event of a crisis like occurred in July, August 1914. Anyway, I digress. The point is that amongst that fraction of the Liberal Party, the need to raise up a race of kind of well-bred, strong, intellectually competent of men in particular, as well as women, to raise them, was important. And that became even more important after the Second Boer War, where Britain did not fare very well. The war should have taken a few months. It took a few years, and it cost a tremendous amount of money. So that's sort of, those are the three things that I would say: empire, intellectual transformations, and also the rise of the labor movement gave rise to this kind of a much stronger labor movement connected to politics, gave rise to new liberalism as a kind of coherent reform agenda within liberalism that argued for the need for things like old age pensions, as well as unemployment insurance, some sort of very skimpy form of health insurance, and saw basically a more active role for the state to play in society. And that is sort of what we consider to be new liberalism. And some people think that, some historians argue that this is the real sort of advent of the British welfare state, that we don't need to think about Beveridge and we don't need to think about Attlee, or we do, but that the origins are here in new liberalism. And I sort of offer criticisms of that in the book, and also a sense that if that is true, if that is the origins of the British welfare state, it also explains some of those shortcomings of the British welfare state.
Yeah, I mean, it's very rarely stated that, one of the great stimuli to greater public expenditures was, the debacle of the Second Boer War. There's a similar, I mean, you can correct me if this is wrong, there's a similar vibe in 1870, 1871 with the Franco-Prussian War, because Prussian soldiers are viewed as being much healthier, much physically stronger, tougher. The reason being they have a much more sort of comprehensive involvement of the state, and they're just healthier. And this creates a major moral panic in French political circles. What happens with the Second Boer War in is it 1899? I don't want to get any of my dates wrong. You tell me.
No, I constantly get dates wrong. But yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very similar thing, because you have these big Afrikaners. They're all, they're eating high protein diets. They're out in, the Transvaal hunting and farming. And then you've got these very small, weak British soldiers on a sort of cliched Victorian diet coming from, Manchester and London, and not being particularly healthy and being outfought, quite frankly. And I think that's true. It's very rarely stated as a major impulse to actually changing quite significant things. So, for instance, I don't believe the Department of Health in this country, I believe, is in the 1900s. The idea of a Department for Health is, is inherently tied up with the idea of the biopolitical notion of having a fighting force of men capable of extending British power overseas. It's not, purely and uniquely about how do we ensure, the maximum health of people here in Britain.
Yeah, and I think that's consistent with the story of the British welfare state that David Edgerton gives us, which is also about the British warfare state. There's a way in which the history of post-war Britain is presented as a kind of cuddly, teleological one, in which all of a sudden you get an acceptance that we're really all in it together, and there's a consensus around the idea of Keynesian, deficit finance, and also of the need for some kind of broad social safety net. But that story can't possibly be true because of how brief the life of social democracy actually was in Britain. I put that in the past tense. But yeah, in the aftermath of the Boer War, you get also, there's, as you say, there's movements that attempt to acts of legislation that mandate inspectors in schools to check on the health of British school children. Another on a kind of cultural level, Baden-Powell, hero of Math King, one of the heroes of the Boer War, helps to found the Boy Scout movement, and Boy Scouts wear khaki uniforms as a way of training up these rather whatever the view of British working class soldiers in the Boer War was, to be strong, fit, self-reliant people. I mean, there's all sorts of other things about Baden-Powell that are much weirder than that. If you want to look into it.
Very quickly, what was the Economist's take on this? We didn't quite touch upon that the rise of new liberalism, these thinkers like Hobhouse and T.H. Green and so on, did they understand, which way the wind was blowing, or was there a bit of a resistance to this?
As the Boer War goes?
After the Boer War, early 1900s, around the time, for instance, the People's Budget, 1909, I mean, this is clearly no longer the liberalism they've been articulating and defending since, already we're looking at a 60, 70-year-old publication. Was there any sort of trepidation or resistance to the changing content of the term liberalism in the early 20th century?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So you talked about contingency earlier. Could the Economist have trod a different path? So yeah, it could have. And this is another moment in this period of the aftermath of the Boer War where it does. So the Economist, criticizes the initial sort of initial diplomacy of Chamberlain and other British officials when it comes to the early stages of the Boer War. But then once the Boer War starts, again, absolutely in favor. They say they're going to wage a war saigner à blanc. They're going to bleed the Boers dry, and they're going to teach them a lesson they'll never forget. So that happens, and that continues until 1906. It's a deeply imperial paper, both in the sense that it's concerned with the empire and that it's in favor of imperial annexations and so forth. By 1907, you get this quite extraordinary figure named Francis Hurst, who is a Cobdenite. He is part of that subdominant tradition within liberalism. So if the Economist represents the dominant version that favors a kind of hard-headed acceptance of the practical need for war in order to create a global capitalist order, you have still people like Francis Hurst, who writes a ton of books on Adam Smith, on Richard Cobden. He's friends with Hobhouse. He's friends with Hobson, who writes the famous book on imperialism as a result of the Second Boer War. And he is an anti-imperialist. He wants, in a limited sense, and he wants the paper and Britain to strike a bargain with Germany, to halt imperial annexations, to trim the budget, because for him, social reform is only going to come about if imperialism can also be brought under control, in part because it's so damn costly. So we're not going to produce 4 more dreadnoughts or 8 more dreadnoughts, which is the kind of obsession of the period, this arms race with Germany. And the liberals, by the way, succumb to the arms race and actually end up promoting it. It's not the case that they are a check on this arms race with Germany. They promise to win it, and they do. All I'd say is that Hurst is a particularly interesting example of a principled Cobdenite at the head of The Economist, who ends up opposing entry into the First World War and is fired for his continued opposition to fighting the First World War. But he is nonetheless ensnared in these contradictions that are internal to the liberal story, because, in my telling, finance is just as central to his conception of the liberal state and of the liberal political economy as any previous liberal. Unfortunately, in a kind of, and maybe unfortunately isn't the right word, but in a kind of Leninist or Hobsonian even reading, finance is a driver of imperial aggression, and it isn't the case that you can simply disentangle them the way that Hurst hoped to. So I kind of try to show the ways that Hurst, despite his very principled opposition to the war, ends up getting caught in these contradictions.
We've got about 20 minutes left, which is, to our immense, it's a tragedy, frankly, because the book covers a great deal in the 20th century too. Very quickly, again, in the interwar period, you obviously have a huge shocks to the system for a liberal. I mean, the First World War, you talk about this, comes as an immense shock to these political milieux that sort of are around the Economist magazine, liberals, liberal imperialists, but also, you know, not necessarily homogenous when it comes to that particular issue. We get the Wall Street crash, 1929. Clearly, that is a bolt from the blue from many of them. We then get the rise of, you know, Mussolini slightly earlier, obviously Hitler and the Nazi Party, 1933. There's clearly a collapse of the League of Nations. You have Japan in Korea and war in Abyssinia and so on. How did the Economist respond to all of this, the Wall Street crash, and basically deglobalization of a kind we hadn't really seen in peacetime during the 1930s?
Well, The Economist is, you know, via its editor, Walter Layton, who takes over the paper in the early 1920s, 1921, I believe, pushes for a solution that is based on collective security. So Layton is involved in running the First World War. He's at the Ministry of Munitions under Lloyd George, and he becomes very close to Churchill. So again, the imbrication of The Economist and its editors with state power is one of the fundamental parts of this story. And Layton promotes a vision of the reconstruction of the global capitalist order based on an idea that the League of Nations, this liberal ideal, can bring about a form of collective security that will prevent another war on the scale of the First World War from happening again. Right. So the first thing that he deals with as editor is the Washington Naval Conference, which is for him an example of collective security in practice, in which Britain, the United States, and Japan agreed to a ratio of capital ships that will, you know, sort of allow the United States and Britain to have the most, and Japan to have a little bit less. And this, of course, has major implications for Britain's power in the Pacific Ocean. It abandons its alliance with Japan, with really grave consequences for what's going to happen in the Second World War with the fall of Singapore, and really the fall of all of the major European empires to the kind of Japanese wave. So, okay, that's how it begins, and that's the one answer to your question, which is that it's through collective security, through the League of Nations. And Layton kind of continues that policy all the way up through the Abyssinian crisis, the Spanish Civil War, and sometimes with very negative consequences, because it means that, you know, for example, Britain offers no aid to Spanish Republicans, and Britain does nothing as regards Italy's bombing of Abyssinia, which is in clear violation of treaty commitments and of the Charter of the League. So that is sort of the international relations element. When it comes to economics, The Economist is you know, and this is maybe gets us to sort of the present day. The First World War is an immense crisis for liberalism, and the historian A.J.P. Taylor once said that, you know, liberalism as an economic doctrine dies during the First World War. Well, I argue this is absurd. You know, liberalism emerges from the First World War with a lot of knocks against it, but it actually comes up with a series of solutions that are the dominant ones when it comes to answering the crises both of international relations and when it comes to dealing with the economy. What is that in the case of The Economist? It's a return to budget orthodoxy, the gold standard, convertibility of the pound, at par with the dollar. It's an attempt to kind of reset the economy to what it was before the First World War, to bring back free trade, the order that had brought Britain so much prosperity and that had made the city of London the absolute apex and pivotal center of that economy, whether it came to ensuring ships and cargo, bills of exchange that allowed global trade to move back and forth across the world, or whether it came to confidence in the pound. The Economist is absolutely at the center of an attempt to recreate that global economy. And the way that I narrate the 1920s and 30s is as an argument with Keynes. So Layton and Keynes, the editor of The Economist, and John Maynard Keynes are both students of Alfred Marshall at Cambridge. They both grew up on the same sort of tradition of neoclassical economics, and yet by the end of the 1920s are in this kind of furious fight with each other over how much can we stretch the idea of liberalism to accommodate this new world order? How creative do we have to be, right? Keynes becomes more and more unorthodox when it comes to answering that question while still defining himself as a liberal. Leighton and The Economist end up being among the main opponents in the early stages of any revision of the kind that Keynes is proposing and that he ends up articulating theoretically in the general theory of employment in 1936. So there's a lot that I could say about that. I kind of went off in a bunch of directions, but
no, it's.
Are there some parallels there? Because you've got The Economist in the 30s. I mean, like you say, it's aligned with ultimately what happens. You get, Britain, I think, stops the gold standard, what, 30, 31, 32?
It falls off the gold standard in 1931. It's forced off because of the crisis.
So it returns to the gold standard, like you say. The idea that liberalism dies is obviously ridiculous, because it returns to the gold standard and it stays there for over, around a decade. In terms of foreign policy, though, you have the League of Nations failing really from the start, despite Woodrow Wilson's preeminent role in drawing it up. And although he was an internationalist, he had some extraordinarily horrible things to say about non-white races. The US doesn't join the League of Nations. And yet you have this publication which understands itself as sort of a liberal internationalist publication, albeit limited to the global north, giving these policy prescriptions, what we'd call them today, and yet nobody's really listening. I mean, there's a little bit of a parallel there between the 30s and today, in so much as The Economist has really been lost. You talk about this at the end of the book, really in the conclusion, since 2008, but specifically since 2016. It didn't really see Brexit happening. It didn't really foresee Trump. And then they don't even come out in defense of Matteo. I didn't know this. It's a great little anecdote. They don't even come out in defense of Matteo Renzi's proposed constitutional reforms, which went to a referendum. Ultimately, he lost. It was ultimately a vote of confidence, no confidence in his government. He fell. He's no longer the prime minister. They refused to do that because they said, look, we can't afford to be on the wrong side of the debate for the third consecutive time. Yeah. And then, of course, there's Jeremy Corbyn in 2017. The Economist is clearly lost in the 2020s. We've now got the coronavirus. It can't really make sense of events. Can you talk a bit about that? And has it ever happened before to this extent? I mean, you've looked through the archive of material. The Economist kind of, its modus operandi is offering convenient, neat, simple, executable answers, which right now it can't really do. Has that ever happened before?
Yeah, I mean, the 1920s and 30s, I think, are a good example of The Economist not having answers as to why phenomenon like mass unemployment are taking place. They don't have a good answer to that. They certainly don't have the sophisticated theoretical explanation for the insufficiency of demand that Keynes offers by 1936. For them, a restoration of global trade and bringing down prices to match wages is going to, or bring down wages to match prices is going to do it. So basically, they argue for deflation at a time when Keynes is arguing that we need to inflate and we need to promote pro-growth policies in order to get ourselves out of this endless cycle of massive unemployment and low economic growth. So yeah, I think the parallel is with the 1920s and 30s. But I kind of what I was thinking about before coming on the program, as regards the kind of caesura of the First World War, is that there's a moment that it seems like there's an intense crisis for liberalism, and rightly so, because liberals are, of course, in the end in Britain responsible for having taken the country into the First World War. And I think that's what's so strange about many histories of the Liberal Party prior to 1914 or up to the First World War, is that the liberals are responsible for everything that's good, which includes social reform, but not for anything that's bad that happens after, which includes the First World War. Now, the reason that I was thinking about the 20s and 30s after the First World War is that this moment of apparent crisis for liberalism actually is a kind of like a rubber band. It gets stretched and stretched, but then it snaps back. And I'm not as convinced that the sort of worldview of The Economist, the ideology of the dominant strand of liberalism that I argue it is exhausted. I mean, in the sense that people do not accept its answers as legitimate, or that it is capable of inspiring a kind of hegemonically accepted set of concepts for understanding the world, perhaps. But insofar as the policy prescriptions that it advocates continue to be the ones that are implemented, that I think we're still seeing. So, for example, the white paper that the government published maybe a couple of weeks ago about planning, about local planning, right? NIMBYism and the idea that, not in my backyard, and that if we simply make it easier we cut red tape and we make it easier to build, builders will come in and deal with the shortage of housing in Britain, which has been a problem for many, many years. That is an idea that The Economist has been promoting since long before the crisis. And now it is being peddled out as a way to kind of pump up growth. Actually, The Economist in an editorial in this recent issue says that is actually kind of pretty limp stuff, because what it should really do is authorize construction in the so-called green belt as well, which it doesn't do, right? As well as cutting pensions for the old, right? So the idea that the old and the young should be pitted against one another, that the sort of gray-haired pensioners are living high off the hog while the young can no longer afford college or get a decent job, is a way that The Economist and other liberals are trying to kind of reinvigorate this ideology that, in some sense to us, looks like a zombie ideology, no longer capable of answering the questions, let alone telling us how we got into the mess that we are in the first place. So I guess what I want to caution is that, what I wanted to say was that liberalism does have this amazing ability to kind of adapt to changing circumstances and to crises. And I think, we see it not just in the kind of reigning Tory party, but in what's happening to the Labour Party, and also in the unique history of the Labour Party in Britain. So the dominance of liberal ideology in British history, I think, is just as much reflected in the kind of history of the Labour Party as it is in the kind of awfulness of Boris Johnson's or Theresa May's or David Cameron's Tory party. And I don't disagree on that, but that was sort of something. No,
I don't disagree with that. I think drawing that parallel between now and the 30s, it's done very lazily, right? Because that was the last time we had deglobalization, we had rising far right. But I think it can be seen just through a very simple content analysis of The Economist then and now, and a sort of general political zeitgeist and how they've responded to it. It's the first time they've seen a drift. But like you say, they then recover quite significantly. I think I'll sort of finish with this. I mean, do you think that there's something that the left can learn from The Economist? Because its output is always intended to exercise a political impact, and yet they often do come from what might be called a utopian disposition. They start with first principles and then work their way out. I remember reading Andrew Neil's autobiography. It's sort of BBC Anchorman.
I thought I was the only one who read that.
No, it's a good book, isn't it?
It's definitely interesting. Yeah,
it's a good what do they call it? A pièce d'occasion. And if you want to understand the sort of 80s right wing zeitgeist, this is great. He would repudiate, I'm sure, many of the words he's written down with his own pen today. But what's interesting is his first job was at the Conservative Research Department, I believe. Then he's at The Economist. Then he's basically poached from The Economist, and he goes to the Sunday Times. He's quite explicit. He says, I viewed myself on the radical right. I was to the right of Thatcher and Keith Joseph. I was there to keep them honest. I wanted to make them go further right, further right. He's very much an ideologue, very much, overt zealot for these ideas. Now, given the longevity of The Economist and its political influence, do you think there are lessons to be learned there for the left in terms of political output, etc., or do you think that that's what we should not be doing? Sort of, is it propagandistic? Is it overly didactic? I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, one thing to say is that Marxists have always read The Economist, and there's a certain admiration for The Economist among the Marxist thinkers that I admire, who I dealt with in the book, and that starts with Marx, who read The Economist very carefully, in part because it supplied such excellent data on what was happening. So in addition to its kind of glib doctrinal statements of 3 answers to this question, 3 answers to that question, this is how you deal with the crisis in X country and privatize these three things and so forth. It also provides a stunning array of data and information, and it provides a completely global perspective, and it has over 26 newsrooms all throughout the world, and that is significant. And I think it's particularly significant on the left in the United States and in Britain, which, speaking very generally, can and has tended to be nationalistic and inward-looking. And one of the extraordinary things about the Corbyn project, and I was thinking about this just in the last few days, is how deeply internationalist Corbyn was, and that is actually unprecedented as a leader of the Labour Party, that there should be a committed internationalist. Perhaps the only example, briefly, is George Lansbury between 1931 and 1935, who inherited a Labour Party that had been absolutely decimated by the defection of Ramsay MacDonald and Philip Snowden in the crisis of 1931 and the formation of a national government in which those two fellows left the party to head a government of national unity with a doctor's mandate to cure a financial crisis, right? And that is one of the things that I wanted to talk about when it comes to the kind of sheer hegemonic dominance of the liberal ideology in Britain, is that the Labour Party emerges not in defiance or hostility to the old declining Liberal Party, but actually under the wing of the Liberal Party. And so the kind of opposition that we saw the Labour Party embody under Corbyn, and now that we have seen completely tamped down under Starmer, is actually a reversion to norm. So when it comes to what the left should do and how the left should deal with the dissemination of information, our point of view, and so forth, I think that The Economist does offer some lessons when it comes to constructing an ideology, a worldview that is both coherent and comprehensive. And I think that we should aspire to not only have as high a quality of international coverage, but also to be as sort of unafraid, perhaps a little bit less glib. That would be nice, and perhaps also to cover and to deal with those sections of the economy and society that The Economist rarely reaches. And I think that also involves breaking with, or trying to come to terms with, or understand the economic weight of the City of London. So, you know, one of the points of my portrait of The Economist when it comes to the left is to show how even the Labour Party in the 1940s and 50s takes over and inherits a certain conception of the way that the British economy should work, and that economy is pivoted on the City of London, and that it also pivots on a conception of British power in the world that pivots on the City of London and on empire. There's so much more that I would like to say about this, and I tend to have these slightly meandering responses this morning in New York, but maybe we can talk more about all this stuff another time.
It's been a great interview. We'll get you back maybe in a month or two. We can talk about some of the relationship of The Economist to the CIA and American hegemony, because although it's a British publication, its apogee is really during the years of American empire.
We didn't talk about spies at all. That was a terrible mistake.
Well, dude, that's a whole show in and of itself.
Okay.
Alexander, thanks so much for joining us. You've been a great guest.
Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure. Fantastic book. Good luck. Have a nice day.
You too.
Bye. Bye.